Hi, I'm Shane. I teach in photography, and I'm going to share, I guess, a couple of insights and ways of working, in particular ways of working with rubrics and SpeedGrader and through Canvas, of course. And I think, like many of us, I do have a bit of a love-hate relationship with rubrics. I find them to be quite operational, functionally frustrating at times. However, that frustration is outweighed by the value of being able to use them effectively for student assessment, of course. And I tend to think, because I work in photography, and I teach in a really creative field of practice. I predominantly teach ways of making images and ways of responding to language of photography and the kinds of the trends and things that are happening around photography internationally and how that can apply to a student's practice. But at the same time, also teach real hardcore skills in photographic image making. So when I think of rubrics, I think of them as a way of providing that real summative feedback in relationship to assessment criteria. And then the sort of the more formative feedback comes through conversations with students, either recorded feedback on their assessment, or we do kind of public crit sessions, reviews of work where I'm able to provide feedback on the work that they're producing. I think when you align rubrics with that whole kind of the big pyramid of acronyms from, that kind of AQF level idea around skills, knowledge, and the application of skills and knowledge through to program learning outcomes, course learning outcomes, assessment tasks, assessment criteria, they can become a really valuable way of aligning all of those things pedagogically, structurally. And so I think the way that I approach them really is in relationship to those assessment criteria. And so if we take a look at one of the courses here, I'm going to show you two courses. One will be sort of like a first year undergraduate course, and then the other one will be a postgraduate Master of Photography course. And so in the first year course, we've got three really straightforward criteria: applying specific skills, creatively interpreting the task. So I give them a set task, and then they're able to sort of creatively respond. And then, sort of aligned with that is the sort of the selection of images. And if we look at, good old test student in our rubric, we can see those three criteria sitting there. And then, of course, the rubric across the top here. We've experimented with a whole range of different ways of describing each of these levels. But I think I've landed back on you either haven't done it, you've only just managed to do it. You're doing it reasonably well, but nothing spectacular. You're doing it very well. Not that I would ever use the word very. You're doing it reasonably well, and you're meeting all of those criteria at a certain level. And then HD obviously being that they're sort of working at a really high level. And I really like using rubrics with long descriptions. I see people use all sorts of interesting descriptors here, from you're working at a pass level, at a credit level, at a distinction level. That's not really helpful to the students. It's sort of more ticking boxes and giving them a score, I guess. But I prefer to use something that's quite descriptive, mostly because they get a sense of how they have responded specifically to that criteria. But also they can see then, of course, okay, well, if I'm only getting a credit, here's what I need to do to get to a pass. And then when we think about creative interpretation for a first year undergraduate course, it's really how are they responding to the task? How are they thinking creatively about ways of making the kinds of images that they need to make in order to be able to do that? And so when it comes time to assess, I click a button. I always use a point range. And so if I think 40 is too high for them, I might just type in, like a 38 or a 37. It'll still sit in that band. Likewise, maybe they've done really well here, but only just tipped over from one to the other, and likewise down here back. And, maybe it sits like that. And, then they sit at that sort of 78 out of 100. And this is a cumulative, obviously, it's weighted, and then that translates through to what they ultimately end up receiving at the end of the semester. But it's very much, the rubrics in these kinds of courses are very much responsive. Students respond to the kinds of work that we give them. Whereas when we shift into the master space, it's much more about us responding to the kind of work that the students is providing to me, but still within, obviously, a criteria framework. But it's a little bit less prescriptive, and it does rely on them researching and actively engaging with the industry and various sectors that sort of connect through to that. And then when we look at how I would use something like this, again, there's the four criteria, and then I would literally come through, as per the other one, and just tick whichever box it is. But then this one is sort of more heavily related to the kinds of feedback that we might provide a student. So this is their summative kind of scoring, but then the feedback that they receive is much more in that sort of public crit space. And so just sort of summing up then and back into that first year course, I think the real advantage is students are able to see what they can see and how they're being assessed against those criteria. And when I write these rubrics and we sort of devise the criteria, at this level of study, it's very much about what are the skills that the students need to be able to develop, and it's in a reasonably tight framework. And so the rubrics respond to that accordingly. And if we look at something like Photoshop skills, it's about the sorts of tools that they're using. It's about the process and how they're editing their images. It's ways of then looking at the bottom here. I think this is sort of where these differences, kind of come from. I'm saying here that they're doing it very well and they're using the tools very well, but they're sort of using them, following instructions. Whereas what they need to really be doing is experimenting and testing different methods to really determine what is the most appropriate one for their images. And then here, sort of reinforcing that by saying, well, yeah, that's exactly what you are doing. I think there are lots of advantages in using rubrics, and I think the more you unpack it at the beginning of the semester before you start delivering the course, the more advantageous and the more meaningful they can be for students. And if you are going to use them, I think there's a real need to be as descriptive as you possibly can. You only have to do it once. You do this and then, you don't have to write the same thing in the comments over and over again or sort of verbally speak them. And I think over time you develop the sorts of language and you know what the sorts of things are that you need to be saying consistently. So you may as well put it into a rubric and make life easier. So yeah, I don't love them in Canvas. Actually think rubrics were better in Blackboard, but that's okay. But I do really like what they represent, and I do like the way that they can support students. And I think the feedback that I tend to get from students is that they see this as meaningful and valuable to them. And so I think it is worth persevering and worth doing. Thanks.